Cybersecurity is a hot topic in digital transformations. Organizations face a number of threats in terms of outside nefarious hackers, as well as internal threats and just misappropriation of information. Privacy laws, a lot of different things are affecting how organizations view cybersecurity. So I recently gave a keynote presentation to tackle this problem and talk about some solutions and strategies for your cybersecurity efforts as part of your digital transformation. And I want to share that presentation with you here today. So we're going to talk just about the importance of cybersecurity and how it relates to your ERP implementation or any sort of technology initiative. Just to start, I'm just curious, have any of you had, within your organizations now, have any of you had any sort of major cybersecurity breach? Wow, it's actually more than I thought. So a little over half of you have had some sort of cybersecurity breach. Does anyone want to share a war story?
But they had a ransomware attack and actually took their data and they wanted ransom, but they did not go forward with that. They ripped down the bare bones and built back up again from our backups.
Okay. Was this an ERP system, financial system, or what was the
whole in our network?
Oh, okay. And is it like, so hosted yourselves on-prem? Okay. So that's a good, unfortunate case study of the risk of cybersecurity. How long did that take you to sort that out? Not you, but the organization.
We were back running in 2 days, but the analysis said it came from a clicked email that somebody had gone through. But I think it took about 2 days to get everything back up.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 days of chaos and disruption.
2 days we lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And then anyone else want to share a story in the back here?
It was our engineering server, so it wasn't anything that hosted Epicor. We only keep our SolidWorks on engineering servers. Ransomware.
I mean, there's some good lessons in both these stories. I mean, one is, you talk about on-premise and the fact that it was an email phishing sort of cyber attack. You talk about even with third-party IT support, which presumably I would assume they're somehow monitoring your network, your systems to watch for that sort of thing, and it's still happened to you. And so sounds like you had the right preparation or the right idea in mind. And that's what we want to talk about today, because I think a lot of organizations treat cybersecurity as a reaction. Once we have a challenge or a problem, then we'll solve it, we'll fix it. And when you mentioned AI too, the advanced AI aspect of it, and I think that's a whole nother thread that you just opened up there with third-party systems in general. When you've got AI and other bolt-on legacy systems, whatever, those are all loopholes or areas of exposure and risk for cybersecurity attacks. So when you're going through an ERP implementation, if you're implementing Epicor or any other system, you can count on Epicor to have solid cybersecurity hosted in the cloud, but they can only do so much. And they can only manage a certain part of cybersecurity risk. And there's a lot more to just what Epicor would do, what any software vendor would do. A lot of it's internal, and a lot of it is related to your own integration of systems and the way you train people. And there's definitely a human component that oftentimes gets overlooked in this whole thing. So that's what we're going to talk about today is cybersecurity resilience, what you can do, and how you can be thinking about cybersecurity as you go through your Epicor or any other sort of ERP implementation. How many of you right now are in the process of implementing Epicor or another ERP system right now? I assume Epicor. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't Epicor, I assume. But is anyone implementing now? How many of you are using Epicor now? Okay. So you're all post-implementation. How many of you are on the most recent version in the cloud, pretty well up to date? Okay. Okay, great. So a little over half of you are on a modern version of Epicor in the cloud? Okay. Most of you in the cloud. So that's a solid start, but that only gets you so far. Epicor can't control everything you do, everything your people do, everything your IT department does. They can control their applications and lock that up or tighten that down, but there's a lot more to it, as we'll get to here today. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about myself, just a quick introduction, which I pretty much already did. We'll talk about the cyber risk landscape in 2025. We'll talk about what cyber resilience is, and then we'll talk about how to build a resilient enterprise to guard against cyber attacks, and then we'll get into some case studies and best practices at the end of the presentation here today. So just real quickly, my background is I've been doing ERP implementations for about 25 years. For better or for worse, it's all I've ever done in my career. Ever since I got out of grad school, I started as an ERP consultant, doing big, massive, gnarly SAP implementations back the first 2 or 3 years of my career. And then throughout my career, I realized that there was a need for more independent voices and advisory services within the ERP space, because it's a pretty well-oiled sales and marketing machine that we work within in the ERP space. So I felt like there was a lot of bias and a lot of blind spots in the industry. And so that's why I wanted to start a company like Third Stage. It was truly independent. We work closely with Epicor. We work closely with all the other vendors as well, but we're not affiliated with them. We don't get paid anything. I'm not getting paid to be here today. Epicor has never paid me anything for anything or any recommendation or anything like that. Sometimes we recommend Epicor, sometimes we don't. They understand that that's the price you pay, or good or bad, of having an independent consulting firm like us. But that's our whole vision, is to be an independent tech agnostic voice of a reason for our customers. And so the beauty of it is not only being vendor independent, but also looking at the whole big picture, because we're not focused on just one system like Epicor or any other ERP system. What it allows us to do is really look at the whole landscape of your entire digital strategy, your entire technical landscape, including the non-technical aspects of people and process and strategy. So that's a big part of what we do, is really focus on being independent, but also looking at the whole big picture of what's required to be successful. A lot of the work I do is related to expert witness as well. So we do a lot of expert witness work when there's a lawsuit related to cybersecurity, or more often it's a failed implementation. Although I will say I have yet to testify in any court case involving Epicor. I don't know if that's just because I haven't seen them or if they don't exist, but it is a good data point for me, because I've done just about every other system out there, either on the plaintiff or defense side, providing expert testimony to those different parties. So there's a lot of good lessons from some of these failures when you see these extreme failures, or even just hear the case studies that you two just shared today, which thank you for spilling your guts related to your recent cyber attacks. But you learn a lot from those case studies. Like seeing and hearing someone who's actually been through it, seeing what the consequences are, it becomes a lot more real. It's not just a cool PowerPoint deck that I'm going to show in front of you today. It's actually something that people are living day to day, as we saw here today. What I want to do today is start off by talking about the cyber risk landscape in 2025. If you step back and look at some of the recent, well-known, well-documented cybersecurity attacks, there's been a number of them. You have Oracle Cerner just had a major cybersecurity attack, and they're obviously a software vendor. They presumably have world-class IT security to manage their hosted cloud solutions, but they themselves had a cybersecurity attack. So that goes to show, for example, that even vendors aren't 100% immune to this problem. You also have there's another smaller ERP vendor called Smart ERP, and they had a recent cybersecurity attack as well, where they got access to customer information and financial information and sensitive, confidential information that was hosted on their systems. So those are just a couple examples of technology companies that have had issues with cybersecurity. And then, of course, retailers and the credit card breaches and others that are hosting sensitive customer information. Those organizations are bigger targets. There's a bigger bullseye on companies that have a lot of data, which for a lot of you as organizations, you probably have a lot of sensitive information, but imagine you times however many thousands of customers might be on the same hosted cloud platform, which makes it an even more appealing cybersecurity attack if I'm a hacker or someone that has nefarious intent, which I'm not a hacker, by the way. I'd be a terrible hacker. But that's some of the challenge for organizations. So even if you're a widget manufacturer, you're not a well-known brand, you still have vulnerabilities, and you still have to be aware of what some of the challenges are. I assume, the two of you that shared your case study, I assume that there's better-known companies out there than you. Are you one of the better-known Fortune 100 companies that everyone knows about, or are you a lesser-known organization? Just out of curiosity, you can tell me your company name or not. It doesn't matter. But so you've got a niche. You're a leader in your niche. Would the average household know your name? Okay. Point being that even no matter what niche you're in, no matter how under the radar you are, you still have information that's valuable to cybersecurity hackers and vulnerable to attacks. And there's a lot of different types of cybersecurity attacks too. I think a lot of people think of it as a hacker is going to hack into my system or send me an email and I click a link and that's going to take down my systems. That is a real threat, but the bigger threat and the more common threat is the stuff that goes under the radar that's sort of behind the scenes and internal. It's that third-party legacy app that's hosted on-prem that hasn't been updated in 20 or 30 years with any sort of modern technology or cybersecurity protocols. You integrate that legacy system because you have to keep it. Maybe it's regulatory, maybe it's a competitive advantage, whatever. You integrate that system to Epicor or any other ERP system. And people realize I don't need to go after the Epicor software. I can go after that third-party weak link in the chain, attack it there, and get to the Epicor data. So that's an example of how just your own internal IT department could unintentionally create cybersecurity risk. Another risk, which is potentially even bigger than that, is your employees. And I'm not talking about employees that are trying to rip you off or steal information. I'm talking about people that just don't realize what they're doing when it comes to setting security profiles or having super user access to all these different functions and applications. That open access is a common challenge, and oftentimes that's the root cause of cybersecurity breaches. So in other words, you're putting your data at risk, even if it's not an outside hacker necessarily coming in and intentionally attacking your system. It could be your internal people that are unintentionally and unknowingly putting your information at risk because there's such open access to data and information throughout the application. And this is a really tricky one because we're going through implementations. One of the big service offerings we provide is change management. So the people side of things. And a lot of times you come in with the intent like, hey, let's get as many people involved as possible because we want to build ownership and buy-in and make sure we test the system thoroughly and all that good stuff, good intention stuff. But what the conflict there is, by giving people more access and giving super user rights to all these different people so they can help test the software, help design processes and all that stuff, you've opened up more cybersecurity risk. So we've got a conflict here. Do we want to involve people and have that sort of buy-in and involvement, or do we want to tighten up security and lock things down with a zero trust sort of policy? And those are two conflicting things that there is no right answer. But you've got to find that right balance to make sure that you're considering both. And obviously, if you go through a implementation process, like many of you have, it sounds like recently, you go through user acceptance testing, training, and all that stuff. When you go live, that's when you can tighten things down, even if you had broader rights for people during the implementation. But the problem is most people don't go back and fix that stuff. They implement it with open access and access to more information that people actually need, and that creates problems later on in a post-go-live production environment. And by the way, one thing that's important to note is that second to last bullet here, which is this isn't just an issue of taking down our information or having privacy issues or leaking confidential information, which alone is a big deal, but it's also about just your overall operations. I mean, these cybersecurity attacks can take down your systems entirely to where you can't ship product, you can't take customer orders, you can't close the books. All that stuff is at risk if you have a cybersecurity attack. So the consequences and the disruption and the cost of cybersecurity attacks is a very real and materially expensive, risky thing that organizations face. So when we talk about cyber resilience, it's about how do we build that cybersecurity mentality within our environment, whether we're in the middle of an implementation or, as in the case of most of you here today, you've already implemented an ERP system like Epicor. And there's four pillars of cyber resilience. You have the prevention, which is sort of playing defense and trying to put the policies in place and the protocols in place that will prevent the cybersecurity attack in the first place. But then you have to do additional defense, even more defense with detection, and then ultimately going on offense with response and recovery. So you want to have a clear policy and a clear set of processes in place when a system does go down. I know in the back you mentioned that the third-party IT department provided some of that detection and response sort of help, but ideally you prevent it in the first place. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is that we can prevent first. But we also have to have policies and processes in place if we don't succeed 100% of the time in that prevention, in those prevention efforts. And it's pretty reasonable to assume that most organizations are going to have some sort of cybersecurity breach or issue. So you have to have those processes in place, even if it's a small percentage chance of it happening, which I'd argue it's actually probably bigger than most of us think. But even if it is small, you still need to have the process in place so you can recover as quickly as possible and bring your systems and your operations back up as quickly as possible. So we talked a little bit about ERP systems and how oftentimes the ERP system itself isn't the issue, especially for most of you that are on a modern version of a cloud system. You've got probably tighter cybersecurity than you've ever had in many cases, but that's just one part of the equation. And that's just one link of vulnerability or potential vulnerability in the entire chain. So when you look at potential integration or even lack of integration between multiple systems, that's an issue. How many of you are using some sort of third-party bolt-on to Epicor in your current use of it? Okay. Half of you, roughly? Almost half? Those third-party systems, how many of those would you say are on-prem or homegrown, outdated types of technologies that you're bolting onto Epicor? Okay, so a little less than who originally responded. But that's a vulnerability right there, and that's probably the bigger risk than Epicor itself or your core ERP system. It's going to be those small little niche bolt-on systems that you built to do some custom workflow or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish with it. And then there's also lack of user training and internal controls. A lot of times people think of segregation of duties as a Sarbanes-Oxley thing, and if you're not publicly traded in the United States, it doesn't really matter. You don't necessarily need to have segregation of duties in the same way a publicly traded company would. But segregation of duties is something that's super powerful from a cybersecurity perspective because it enables you to tighten up the process to where people have clear roles and approval thresholds and things like that, to where the same person that creates a vendor can't then go pay that same vendor, for example. So if I work for you and I have access in your ERP system, if I create a vendor called Eric Kimberling LLC, and then I turn around and pay Eric Kimberling LLC $1 million, that's an example of a cybersecurity breach and something that you really want to make sure you tighten up and understand what people's roles and responsibilities are. And again, for those of you that are super focused on the human change management side of things, it may sound like something that's good to give people open access and flexible processes and open transparency to data. All that stuff is well-intentioned, but then you have to look at the dark side. What does that do from a cybersecurity perspective to potentially put that data and our systems and operations at risk? And then every vendor you work with too, if you have any third-party vendors in addition to your core ERP system, those vendors, you've got to rely on them to have the same cybersecurity protocols and controls, and it's the weakest link. It's the one that doesn't have the tight protocols and controls in place. That's the weak link, and that's where your real exposure and risk is. Even if the rest of your systems are completely locked down, all it takes is that one system to bolt on that does not have the same cybersecurity thresholds. So to build a cyber-resilient enterprise, there's a few things that you can do, and especially now, post-implementation, you've already invested heavily in your ERP system, presumably. So what can you do now? You've already got the system in place. The protocols are what they are. Epicor's got their cybersecurity protocols. You're probably not going to change those or have much influence over that. But what can you do as an organization? What can you do to protect the things outside of your core ERP system? Well, first is to conduct a digital risk assessment. So really looking at where are the vulnerabilities and understanding what the risks of each of those vulnerabilities are. So really that overall assessment of your current systems, your current landscape. And this is a hard one for a lot of organizations because they implement an ERP system and they're just glad to be done. They're glad to go back to their day jobs. They sort of forget about it. They set it and put it on autopilot to run the company, which is what you want. But at the same time, you've got to go back and look at where could we optimize and where could we improve. By the way, not just cybersecurity, just overall business value. That's a whole other presentation that I've given before, but we'll set that aside for the time being and talk about cybersecurity being one piece of that. There's also cyber hygiene best practices, making sure that you've got proper tests and controls and training and all the stuff that goes into making sure that you as an organization are well aware and conditioned and trained to follow best practices as it relates to cybersecurity. And then also, as I mentioned before, strengthening access management. So making sure that you have clearly defined user profiles, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and the way you build their user access and user rights. That's a big, important part of cybersecurity. Again, has nothing to do with outside hackers. You're talking about your own internal people, and we all want to assume that our people are great people, and they probably are. But it's those accidental mistakes. It's that one weak link that can create a bigger problem for the entire organization. So having the governance, backups, and maybe backups aren't as relevant in today's day and age, especially if you're in the cloud, but certainly the data governance is really important. What do we do with our data? How do we protect it? By the way, how do we comply with international privacy and data privacy laws? Because if you're operating in Europe, for example, or in the EU, there's pretty strict GDPR rules there around how you protect data and data privacy overall. And then also making sure we've got a system architecture in place that supports cyber resilience and supports our cybersecurity risk mitigation efforts as well. So just to give a couple of examples here of case studies, I talked about Oracle Cerner and how they had a breach. Smart ERP had a breach. Target was a recent example where a bunch of credit card information got stolen off their systems for millions of customers of Target. And those are just a few examples. I mean, there's all kinds of, it seems like every couple of weeks you hear about a big cybersecurity breach of some sort. And these are all big companies too. These are the ones you hear about. These are the well-known organizations that presumably have world-class IT systems and departments and resources at their disposal, but even they have issues. So that just goes to show that even the larger, more sophisticated, more mature organizations on the technology side, they still struggle as well. And so we can't prevent this stuff 100%, but we can put the controls in place and the processes in place to at least minimize the potential risk of those sorts of attacks. So we talked about a couple really that are probably better than these, but I'll share a couple more than in addition to what you both shared at the beginning of the presentation. One example is a manufacturing company that was hit with a ransomware attack during their ERP upgrade. And that's a really vulnerable position for a lot of organizations, is during the implementation process, because you're moving data around, you're opening up access, you're trying to figure out how the system works. There's not a lot of full understanding of the system yet and the consequences of some of the decisions you're making, because you're working through all that during the implementation. So that's a particularly vulnerable time, especially when it comes to data, potential data breaches. But in this case, during the upgrade and shortly thereafter, they had a 3-week shutdown, loss of production, and also some data segmentation. They had offline backups, layered recovery protocols, et cetera. So that's what they did to solve it, was to put those backups and recovery protocols and data segmentation, the segregation of duties, the defined roles and responsibilities and user access, all those things were done after the fact. But again, that was very reactive. It was in reaction to and response to a big attack that brought down their operations for 3 weeks. The idea here is, let's figure out where we could possibly have an issue. Let's also quantify the impact of that issue, by the way. If you were to have a cybersecurity attack, what would that cost you? What could it cost you? And oftentimes that will put it in context for your executives and your leadership team to understand the importance of in these cybersecurity protocols and controls and whatnot. And we see a lot of these, a lot of companies come to us when they're in the middle of an implementation or after an implementation. They'll ask us to help them optimize their use of the system and getting more value out of the systems. And oftentimes what we find is there were cybersecurity issues, and oftentimes that's a pain point they're struggling with, and that's why they end up calling us to come in oftentimes to recover an overall system implementation. Another example is a retailer that had a breach with a supply chain partner. They had data leak of customer records, and what they did to resolve that was vendor risk management and zero trust architecture. So that zero trust architecture is a big buzzword right now in the cybersecurity world, which essentially means you're going to start with not trusting and then find exceptions to why you wouldn't trust someone to have access to information or data. And that runs completely counter to what we were talking about before. When you talk about this from a change management perspective, we're all about being agile and open and transparent, providing access to information and visibility, all that good stuff that creates excitement and buy-in and productivity and all that great stuff. So we've got to figure out how to balance those two, because by doing that, which has very good intentions, we create another dark side or another risk that we've got to deal with. And it may be that we're going to continue to do that and operate in that way, but we've got to have something behind the scenes or on the back end to clean up any potential risk that comes from that mentality and that focus on handling things from a more effective change and openness and transparency perspective. So some ways to build that long-term resilience would be to build cross-functional ownership across IT operations and overall leadership. It is something that needs to get the attention of your executive team if it isn't already on the radar. This is such a big issue, and again, especially if you're operating internationally or you're doing work for the government, there's just a lot of risk you have, and you're more exposed in those environments too, to not just the disruption and the cost to you as an organization, but also any regulatory breaches too, by not having the right policies and the right protections in place. I'm training and simulating regularly, so simulating what a cybersecurity attack could look like, and even trying to conduct a test cybersecurity phishing campaign or whatever the case may be. That's something that our IT department at third stage does. Is they'll mask themselves and create another email, and they'll try to see who clicks on the link, on the fake link, which obviously isn't going to do anything because they're just testing it, but they'll watch and see how many people click on this link. And then they'll tell us, they'll say, hey, here's how many people clicked on this one link. You should be aware of it. Here's something we need to inform them and educate them on. So that's a way to think about it, is just constantly be looking at different creative ways that you could possibly be trying to fool your people. I know it sounds weird to say, but you're trying to fool them, and that's where the learnings come from. And you'd rather have them respond to a fake phishing attempt or a fake cybersecurity attack than a real one, so you might as well do it yourselves and get it out of the system and understand where those weaknesses are. Making sure that as you go through your IT strategy in general, you've already got your ERP system in place, you're probably doing other stuff, assuming you're not sitting still and just rolling with technology as it is today, you're probably constantly changing and improving what you have. And if that's the case, and even if it's not the case, you should have a cybersecurity strategy that's tied into that, and really looking at how can we tighten up our cybersecurity protocols, especially if you have some of those vulnerabilities I've talked about, then you're at higher risk, and you should probably spend even more time and effort and resources on that as part of your IT strategy. And then also looking at independent advisors, and yes, this is a shameless plug for Third Stage Consulting and independent advisors like us, but having someone that's independent that can look outside of just one system and look at your entire landscape but understand how that all ties together and where the risks are is very important, because we're not just looking at things from an ERP or an Epicor perspective, we're looking at it from an overall digital and IT perspective for your entire business. So some ways we can help, and if it's not us, these are things you can do to help prevent these issues. Doing a risk assessment and gap analysis and understanding where our risks are, where the gaps are in terms of what we're doing today versus what best practices are, and what the risks and the potential costs of that disruption and breach might be. That's one thing you could do to get started. There's also having a secure architecture design and roadmap. So understanding that, hey, if we've got this on-prem system that's super outdated and doesn't have cybersecurity protocols, it might be working fine for us right now operationally, but maybe we should think a little bit harder about replacing that system too. Not that we need more reasons to spend money on technology, but that is a pretty good one, especially if you've got that homegrown legacy system that's been rock solid for all these years and decades. That's probably where the biggest risk is, and so you've got to start thinking about how can we move that system to something that's more modern and with cybersecurity protocols for today's day and age. Having vendor-neutral implementation guidance can help too, just making sure you find the right solution for different parts of your operations and technology. And then also change management and user enablement. I talked about how change management and cybersecurity are oftentimes in conflict, but when you put them together, you can actually use change management as a mechanism and tool to improve your cybersecurity, because the more we can educate and train people and understanding what their actions result in, unintentionally potentially, the more visibility and understanding they have, the more aware the organization is going to be, and you're mitigating a lot of risk just by addressing the change management and user enablement component of that. So that's what I've got for you as a starting point. Obviously, there's a lot more detail we can get into. There's a lot more to it, but hopefully that gives you sort of a flyover summary view of how to get the most out of your cybersecurity efforts. At this point, I'll open up to any questions you have. What didn't I cover that you want to chat about here today in these last few minutes?
Yeah. When it comes to operational technology, are there tools out there you'd recommend that can scan our OT environment for vulnerabilities, whether it be legacy systems or even current new systems?
Yes. Give me your information. I'll get you a list. I'm drawing a blank on specific tools that do that, but we have people on our team that are deep in that area. So that's a great question though, because there are tools that are unrelated to Epicor and other ERP providers that look at the entire picture. And again, Epicor's got their stuff. They've got that locked down. It's all the other stuff you've got to worry about even more so. Yeah, great question. Sorry, I can't answer that on the spot, though. Yeah, so the question is, how can you convince management of the importance of investing in cybersecurity when you haven't been through the pain? And that's actually a very similar question that we get even more often, which is, how do you convince executives to do an implementation right when they haven't been through the pain of a failure? And so the companies that we work with that have failed in some way, whether it's in their implementation or their cybersecurity efforts, they just have a certain level of maturity that you can't teach, you can't train it, because they've been through it and they know, they've been burned and they understand it. So the key is, how can you make them feel a little bit of discomfort and pain without actually having going through it? And so the way we often do that is you look at these case studies like the two I talked about here today, or the three that have been shared here today, and you quantify that and say, what if that was us? What would that mean if that exact same thing happened to us? And these are just, a pretty small sample of a couple examples that there's probably ones that are a lot worse than these three we heard here today. But if we take these as sort of starting point case studies and quantify that for our organization, oftentimes that gives you the business case you need to say, this is what it would cost us. If it costs this much in terms of disruption and risk, and we need to invest this much, it just makes more sense that we invest this much as sort of an insurance policy against that sort of thing. And speaking of insurance too, a lot of insurance providers require you to have these protocols in place anyway. So that's a whole nother business case line item, is what if we can't get insured, or what if our insurance rates go up because we don't have proper protocols in place? And then I think you had a question here. Yep, he's asking, how does AI affect offense and defense for cybersecurity? And I'm glad you said that, because actually I had in my notes that I was reading before this to talk about AI, and I didn't. I missed that point. So thank you for reminding me that I didn't talk about that. But I would treat it like I would treat AI like I would any other third-party system. It's a vulnerability and a risk. It's another place that your data is going, and it's another touch point, whether it's directly in your system or if it's through a human that's interacting with an AI system. And that latter example is probably the bigger risk, is because now you've got someone who's taking information and doing something with it with a third party. And so there's a lot of things you have to worry about. I've actually interviewed a couple times on my podcast. I've interviewed an attorney about that topic, because I'm fascinated by it, because I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand the intellectual property laws and things like that. So I wanted him on my podcast so I could just ask him a bunch of stuff about that. And it's a really good interview. If you go to my YouTube channel and just search attorney Marcus Harris is his name. His name is Marcus Harris. If you go to my YouTube channel, look Marcus Harris. I've interviewed him a few times, and the last 2 times have been about that. And he talks about how when you take information out of your system, if it's confidential information, and you're putting it into an open AI model, then you've lost your protection. You're exposing your intellectual property, and you don't have control over it. So you do have to be aware that all this generative AI stuff and some of the agents and things that people are deploying now, it's really cool stuff, but there is risk there that I don't think we fully understand yet, because so many organizations are just dipping their toe in AI. So I think it's a very good point, something to be aware of. In fact, I would say it's another point of tension. AI is awesome. It can do all these game-changing efficiency gains and make us more effective, but it's also exposing us to a lot of risk. So if we don't want to lose the innovation, we've got to really tighten that up and have very clear responsibilities and policies in place and training around how we can and can't use AI, especially if it's third party. If it's Epicor's AI agents or Epicor's AI tools, it's at least staying in the system. But when you're using a third party, that's where the real risk is, or a third party AI agent or bolt-on that goes on top of your ERP system.